Good evening. Greetings from Fourrts. We welcome all the participants to this webinar on artificial intelligence clinical applications in nephrology. Fourrts is in the pharma industry for the past 40 years, following the motto of innovating for good health. Currently, Fourrts products are available all across India and in over 50 countries around the globe. We from Fourrts have complete range of products to help early CKD management and diabetes. We have nephroprotective nutraceuticals like Nephrosave Forte, Nephrosave Keto Tablet, and Sachet for the early management of CKD. We also have medications for kidney stone management, B.P.H, OADs for diabetes management. I'm happy to welcome our director, Dr. Gayatri Veeramani Jayaraman, to inaugurate and host this webinar today. Dr. Gayatri Veeramani Jayaraman is an American board certified physician and nephrologist. She completed her fellowship training in nephrology at Harvard Medical School in the joint fellowship program of the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Massachusetts General Hospital. Post fellowship, she practiced as a nephrologist in upstate New York and served as clinical assistant professor of medicine at Weill Cornell Medical College. In addition to her medical degree and training, Dr. Gayatri also holds a degree in pharmacy from Madras Medical College and a master's in health administration and management from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. With this short introduction, I hand over the session to Dr. Gayatri to welcome our today's chairperson and a very accomplished speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Nagashankar. Welcome, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our chairperson, Dr. Umesh Khanna, and our speaker, Dr. Ravi Talani. Dr. Umesh Khanna is a consultant nephrologist and transplant physician with appointments at multiple hospitals and clinics in Mumbai. He has been in private practice for over 30 years and has a wealth of knowledge. He has helped set up the nephrology department for several hospitals and clinics and currently serves as director of Lancelot Kidney and GI Center and director of Kidney Associates in Mumbai. Dr. Khanna is interested in health education and preventive nephrology and conducts regular training programs in dialysis and other renal-related topics for nurses, technicians, physicians, and medical students. He was a pioneer in establishing the concept of freestanding community dialysis centers in India. He has also published extensively and serves as the principal investigator for several clinical studies. He's actively involved in many medical associations and societies and serves as chairman of Mumbai Kidney Foundation, secretary of Mumbai Nephrology Group, secretary of Amar Gandhi Foundation, and national chairman of the CKD Prevention Cell. We're very happy to have Dr. Khanna with us here today. Thank you, Dr. Khanna.
Thanks. Good evening.
Good evening. I'm also very happy to introduce our speaker and my mentor today, Dr. Ravi Talani. Dr. Thadhani was chair of the Division of Nephrology at Mass General Hospital when I was a renal fellow. He currently serves as Chief Academic Officer at Mass General Brigham. He's also Professor of Medicine and Academic Dean at Harvard Medical School. In the past, he served as Vice Dean of Research at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. We missed him sorely when he was in LA, and being a true Bostonian at heart, he returned to Harvard. In his role as Chief Academic Officer at Mass General Brigham, Dr. Thadhani oversees a $1.8 billion research enterprise. He also oversees graduate medical education for Harvard Medical School and Mass General Brigham. Dr. Thadhani has also successfully managed a research laboratory for about 25 years and published over 300 articles in reputed journals, including the New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, JASN, among others. A lot of you may know him from his groundbreaking research on vitamin D metabolism and preeclampsia. Dr. Thadhani has been inducted to several honor societies and is recipient of multiple distinguished national awards, including the John P. Peters Award from the American Society of Nephrology for mentorship and scientific achievements. A vice nephrologist at the Brigham once told me that an academician is someone who takes the field forward. Dr. Thadhani has a multifaceted approach and has truly taken the field of nephrology forward through his research, education, community, government, and industry partnerships. He has also taught many renal fellows like me in their formative years and junior faculty to think out of the box. He has always been thinking well ahead of his times, and his topic today is a true reflection of this. He shows us the way forward with use of artificial intelligence in nephrology and medicine. With that, I hand over the session to the able and accomplished Dr. Khanna.
Good evening, friends. And thanks, Gayatri, for this kind introduction. Welcome to today's webinar on AI, its clinical applications in nephrology. It's a very contemporary but offbeat topic. When I was asked to choose a topic of interest to all the nephrologists, I thought that during the pandemic, there has been a surfeit of academic topics and webinars, leading to a kind of fatigue and a massive drop in the attendance. So we came across this slightly unusual but very interesting topic of artificial intelligence. So AI, whether you believe it or not, is all around us, whether in the form of your stylish girlfriend Siri or Alexa, or the more strong AI-powered boys like Roomba and many other robots. So before you will know it, AI will become a very critical part of your life and every aspect of our lives. And medicine, including nephrology, is no exception. From the simple Google Home to the more sophisticated personal assistant like Ollie, who can actually decipher and get an idea from your facial expression. And just in case you come home and rest your head on the table, it would ask you, dear, what is the problem in the office? And give you some suggestions and might play the favorite music of yours. And from there onwards, if you have lost a lot of money in the stock market, you could take the help of the robo-advisor who would probably help you in getting back some of your money from the financial analyst kind of profile of it. So, from there, you will realize that AI would form a very important part of healthcare. In fact, it's a game changer. And you will realize that a lot of doctors actually feel threatened by AI, and they feel that it would replace the clinician. But believe me, it will work more as an augmented intelligence rather than an artificial intelligence, and would really augment the clinician in diagnosis, prognosis, and even finding treatment algorithms in a lot of conditions which Dr. Ravi Thadarani would later on elucidate. So, friends, as the father of this field, Mr. McCarthy, he defines artificial intelligence as the science and engineering of creating intelligent machines. So also we have today a very naturally intelligent clinician who augmented his clinical skills with science and engineering and is going to enlighten us on the subject of AI and its clinical application in nephrology. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Dr. Ravi Thadarani. The stage is open for you, Ravi.
Thank you very much, Umesh. First, let me thank Fourrts for this organization and Mr. Nagashankar for his unbelievable organizational and management skills. Let me thank Gayatri. It's always a pleasure. We miss her here in Boston, and she has gone on and done really incredible things. And thank you to Fourrts and Gayatri for the supporting this program. And of course, it's an honor to share the stage with Umesh. As you heard, he essentially summarized my talk in a way that only somebody with such stature and wisdom can do. And that is, this is technology that will complement, not replace, the nephrologists. So in the spirit of dinner talks, I will speak about this particular topic, and also, of course, say to my friends and colleagues in India that I really miss coming back home in many ways and being with colleagues, as Umesh knows, at the Apex forums and other venues, and the wonderful people there that put on such programs. And of course, we look forward to returning to those kinds of activities. So with that, let me begin on this particular topic. As Umesh said, artificial intelligence is everywhere. No matter where we look today, these kinds of applications and technologies are being used. The top left, can we use it to predict earthquakes? When I was in California, in fact, we had an app that we loaded on our phone that gave us notification of whether an earthquake was going to happen in the next 20 to 30 seconds. With regards to loneliness, there are ways of using artificial intelligence to speak to your pets now. As Umesh said, we might get stock advice from others, but also understanding what your pets are saying is maybe equally important. better understanding as to where you might excel. There's no question in areas of banking, marketing, entertainment, really artificial intelligence is quite pervasive. Here's an example I hope will resonate with all of you. It's not a mistake that hit songs all sound the same. When you listen to Bollywood music or K-pop or American pop music, these songs all sound similar. You can take the songs that become hits and figure out what are the rhythm, the tempo, the duration, the beats, and the artists that predict whether or not the song will be successful. And in fact, you can use this not just to predict, but also to devise songs. So in fact, K-pop development and that whole program is designed around artificial intelligence to understand how to create groups that create hit songs. This is really all around us, as Umesh said. In 2017, The Economist highlighted the following article: "The world's most valuable resource is no longer oil, but data. Data has replaced oil in terms of its incredible value." Now, there are a few important points to highlight when I describe oil and data. The first is that we get and gather a lot of data, just as we gather a lot of oil, but oil is not used in its crude form, just like data is not used in its crude form. We take crude oil and manufacture petroleum, diesel, gas, waxes, lubricants, and so too, the data that we bring in, the data that we acquire has to be refined, has to be annotated, has to be curated, has to be divided, and has to be understood. And that represents really the challenge. And how we do that today is really the big problem and potentially the big opportunity, because gathering data is not the issue. It's how we use the data and, more importantly, bring intelligence to that data to complement clinical activity, as Dr. Khanna mentioned, is vital. Here's an example from colleagues at Fresenius Medical Care North America who kindly shared with me their data bases. They have in their current database almost 2 million patients, 500 million hemodialysis treatment items of data, almost 2 billion items of laboratory values, 33 million pieces of information on comorbidities, in-center medications, almost 1.3 billion, home medications, 2.6 billion. I can go on and on and on as one example of hemodialysis just in the United States in terms of the amount of data. Now, let me give you a flavor of what that data means in terms of size. On the bottom, you see the graph from 2010 from Fresenius all the way to 2019. By 2011, there was already 1 petabyte or 1,000 terabytes of information in their database. And you see that growth in 2018, 7 petabytes or 7,753 terabytes. In 2019, 9 petabytes. And just to get a sense of the magnitude of a petabyte, 9 petabytes of data stored in the Fresenius database. If all of that data were put in Wall Street Journal articles, those Wall Street journals would reach the moon and back 9 times. That's the amount of data we're talking about. 9 petabytes of data. 1 petabyte of data, just again for people to get some handle on, is the equivalent of storing 4,000 digital pictures every day for the rest of your life. That's 1 petabyte of data. So you can see that there's just an immense, immense amount of data. And the question for us is, what do we do and how do we make sense of that data? Human evolution would have it such that we look at our outside world and use the senses that we have to make sense of that outside world. We have to use this to adapt, to survive, to create new inventions. That's how human evolution has moved forward. The problem we're facing today is that the current data generation exceeds our cognitive capacity to manage all that information. The senses that we have in general are not able to keep up with that massive amount of data. And so the question is, how do we move forward? And one way, may not be the only way, is to use artificial intelligence tools. Artificial intelligence applications love and require huge data sets. Now, let's begin first with some definitions. There's no universal definition of artificial intelligence, but perhaps in some simplistic fashion, one can argue it's an ability of a machine system to learn, as in fact Dr. Khanna highlighted. Machine learning, which is a subset of artificial intelligence, focuses on algorithms and statistical methods to use patterns and inference or reasoning to learn from those examples to perform specific tasks. Within that umbrella is deep learning. And here it becomes much more complicated because deep learning involves often complex neural networks. And I'll talk about neural networks very briefly, but to simplify it in just a second. All of this sits in this larger category called data science. So in general, artificial intelligence, the way we view it is to allow us to take the information, all that data, learn from it, create patterns, reasoning, and use that information through these algorithms to predict the future or to help us solve problems, as Dr. Khanna said, to pick stocks, perhaps. Now, in medicine, the publications on artificial intelligence have certainly gone up exponentially. Here's two sources of information, Scopus and Web of Science. And you see, even though artificial intelligence came on the scene in the 50s and 60s, in the context of more storage, faster computing, larger gathering of data, the explosion really, at least in medicine, started in 2003, 2005. Now, before this, of course, the explosion happened in other fields, but in medicine, we're seeing it in every context, as Dr. Khanna highlighted. And nephrology is no exception. When you look at, even in 2017 and 18, the kinds of publications in nephrology that highlighted machine learning, artificial neural networking, artificial intelligence, continued to increase, not far behind what otherwise might be considered more standard areas like cancer and heart disease and so forth. So this area is only growing. And interestingly enough, when you look at publications in nephrology, when those taglines are linked to those publications, big data, machine learning, artificial intelligence, they pop up and become of interest, even though, interestingly enough, sometimes they don't actually involve big data in the usual context, or they don't actually involve complex artificial intelligence. Nevertheless, these tags increase the interest level of publications, and putting them in the title often generates a lot of interest. As an example of what that data is doing in our own system, I put this slide in, which is on the left side, in our own hospital system, as Gayatri remembers, we are gathering massive amounts of data using sensors and devices. As you see here, sleep sensors, glucometers, vital signs, and so forth. That's a massive amount of data. We have over 6 million patients in our database. However, we have to take that data and create mechanisms of connectivity. Those mechanisms of connectivity have to be secure. They have to ensure that privacy of individual data are preserved. And then we have to translate that data in some way to make it understandable through these aggregators and interrogators. And finally, we have to interface that data with our electronic health records. So while we talk about the gathering of data as one important component, which is the left side of the equation, and hence this discussion on artificial intelligence, we can't forget that there are many different components to this equation in order to make that data usable, in order to make that data understandable. In the same context as oil and crude oil is not usable, however, the refined oil and separating it into components, whether it be petroleum, fuel, waxes, and lubricants, are in the same fashion we have to make sense. And this is just one example of creating a digital biobank in our own system. Who are those experts that we need in order to make this data understandable, in order to make this crude product usable? We have physicians, and those are all of you, or many of you on this call today. The domain expert to define the goals, to grasp the relevance, to define the clinical questions are unbelievably important to making sure that this whole strategy of artificial intelligence works. Goes back to the point Dr. Khanna mentioned. This complements physicians. It doesn't replace physicians. Together, working with a larger team of data scientists to use capabilities that are analytical and technical to extract the data, engineers to make sure that the flow of that information is private and secure, statisticians to perform probabilities and uncertainty principles, mathematicians to create modeling. As you can see, this is a multidisciplinary area. And of course, in today's world, it's not surprising that many of these people are located in different parts of the world. Obviously, many in India and many in Europe, many in the United States and other places. It's multidisciplinary, and it's a problem in an area that can only be solved by working as teams. But here I put on the left the domain expert as the physician, the absolute key component of making sense of this information. Okay, I know it's dinner time in India, and I apologize for showing this slide, but let me just distill neural networks. So neural networks are essentially a series of algorithms, a series of equations. In fact, almost always regression equations. Those equations are then used to add weights. If you look on the top right, W1, W2, W3, these are weights added to these algorithms. And those weights are essentially where the magic happens, and even the bias, as I will show you, to creating these algorithms to use for prediction. That's then put in an algorithm on the bottom left to define a decision analysis, and probabilities are then determined to come up with an output on the bottom right. These models are what mathematicians and statisticians rely on. Now, that's all I'm going to say about the technical aspects. What I will say, though, is the following. These algorithms are essentially the backbone of the AI components of everything we have today. The AI backbone of Amazon updates itself every 11 seconds. The AI backbone of Uber updates itself twice a week. The AI backbone of Bank of America updates its backbone once every 2 weeks. These are iterative in that they continue to be modified based on how the user interacts with the system. Static algorithms are difficult, but in medicine, we have static algorithms based on some of the applications. The FDA has not approved algorithms to a large extent, but we're now beginning to see from the FDA some algorithms being actually approved to use for imaging, pathology, as we'll talk about. The question from the FDA standpoint is, are these reproducible, and can they be used in many different contexts? Let me share with you some examples of how these neural networks are trained, and also highlight the potential for bias. You have some scientists that come together and on the left define a mountain. The goal here is to define what is a mountain and use a computer algorithm, a neural network, to identify what is a mountain. And so the scientist says that the top left and the bottom left are mountains. The scientist says that those plains and those fields in the middle are not mountains. And so you train the computer to define what is a mountain, what is not. And then you say to the computer, okay, based on what I've told you is a mountain and based on what I've told you is not a mountain, can you predict what these next two pictures are? The sand dune is likely not a mountain, but this different form of a mountain is in fact a mountain. Now you can imagine first and foremost, what you enter to train is how these algorithms are defined. You can outline the surfaces of these mountains and say you can look for jagged surfaces and tall surfaces, and hence begin to train these particular algorithms. So you then say, once you've developed this kind of algorithm, you can take thousands and thousands of images on the left that are mountains and thousands of images that are not mountains, go to a neural network and begin to train even further and refine which pictures are mountains and which pictures are not mountains. And you start with a 50% probability and say that you have two categories and you don't know which one is which. And every time it gets something correct, you increase the weight. And every time it gets something wrong, you decrease the weight. And over time, with that kind of education, the algorithms begin to identify what's a mountain and what's not. And now all of a sudden you're a mountain predictor, a predictor of mountains at the accuracy of 93%. You can then introduce new pictures of mountains and non-mountains, and you can assign a probability of what is a mountain and what is not, and essentially come up with an algorithm that defines a mountain prediction tool. Well, you can imagine this is the same as coming up with a tool for diabetic nephrosclerosis, a tool for IgA nephropathy, a tool for pneumonia, and even potentially a tool for depression. And so then you can introduce a new picture, and the computer accurately defines what is a mountain and what is not a mountain. And all of a sudden you have a predictive tool using machine learning and neural networks in the space of artificial intelligence. But there are problems, because you have defined what pictures you put in to the computer to define a mountain and what pictures you have put in to not define a mountain. And let me make this even more simplistic. You can ask the algorithm to define and characterize what is a chihuahua. And here you see a picture of a chihuahua on the right side looking at you. And when you put in chihuahua on your computer, on your smartphone, you get a picture of many chihuahuas. Now the neural network, however, looks at the features of that chihuahua and unfortunately cannot distinguish that chihuahua, let's say, from a blueberry muffin, and hence the problem of bias. Here's another example. You can look at these kinds of dogs. They're called golden doodles, and these dogs can be put in an algorithm. You can say anytime you see these kinds of dogs, it should define what is a golden doodle. But the problem is the artificial neural network cannot distinguish these kinds of dogs from fried chicken, and hence the problem of bias, because you have put in the computer what you want to define, and the computer is unfortunately not perfect. And hence the first problem in artificial intelligence, which is bias. The data sources we put in create the bias. Importantly, we have to put in data sources, but those data sources we put in, those pictures of mountains, those pictures of IgA nephropathy, those pictures of pneumonia, are what influences the output of the artificial intelligence. And as you can imagine, if whatever you put in has some biases and does not account for differences in race or gender or geography, then those biases are only perpetuated. And that's the problem with artificial intelligence in terms of the bias, because it all depends on what you put in and how you train these algorithms. Now, here's a concrete example I hope resonates with my colleagues in Mumbai. Artificial intelligence is used and algorithms are used to create driverless cars. Many of you have heard of this. Those algorithms define traffic rules. They define the partitions between lanes. They define signals, left, right, stop signal. And those can be put in algorithms and used to create driverless cars. They have been done successfully in many different countries. But the question is an algorithm developed, for example, in Germany with traffic used to predict traffic in Mumbai? I would hate to argue with Dr. Khanna that maybe it won't be so perfect. It probably has a better chance of predicting your stocks than it does traffic patterns in general. But that's the problem. We take these algorithms and we put in what we need to teach it, and all of a sudden we ask it to perform in spaces and areas that it wasn't designed necessarily to do. Unfortunately, this has also led to some accidents. Some of you might remember in 2018, a self-driving Uber car killed a pedestrian in Arizona. And why is that? So first of all, this is a highway. If you see here, the car was traveling on a highway and a woman walking her bike was crossing the street. Now, you can argue, wait a second, why didn't the algorithms identify a human being walking across the street? Well, it turns out that the algorithm actually could have recognized a woman crossing the street. The algorithm also could have recognized a bicycle. The problem is she was walking her bicycle, and the combination of walking a bicycle and not riding a bicycle was not built into the algorithm, and hence was not seen as an obstacle. And unfortunately, then she was killed. Now, you can argue you might make a mistake in Amazon defining what you should buy and what you shouldn't, or in your Uber ride as to what kind of car you've chosen or what kind of price you've paid. But you cannot afford to make a mistake when you begin to use these kinds of algorithms to make critical medical decisions, and hence the challenge of medicine. In 2018, Ridley said, we tend to overestimate the effect of technology in the short run, yet we underestimate the effect in the long run. What about digital health and in medicine? Here's an example in the Lancet, published a few years ago, that said in a review of over 31,000 different studies, and in this case using imaging, which is the most objective, at least features and points of information we have, the problem is we could not externally validate more than 25 of those algorithms. And hence the challenge of what we put in defines the success or failure of whether or not we have a successful algorithm. I've talked about bias of what we put in, but we also have to remind ourselves that also introduces or includes uncertainty. And how we manage that uncertainty is absolutely critical. We can put probabilities of the certainty here, but we can't be perfect. The top right identifies learned associations may memorize specific data set patterns, but do they generalize? Algorithms can't correct for biases due to feedback loops. What does that mean? When you introduce a bias and you continue to say that a mountain only looks in a certain way and it continues to feed that back, then it is unlikely something that resembles a mountain but you did not put in is defined as not a mountain. It's the same way that if you get a feature of IgA nephropathy that doesn't look typical, it will define it as not IgA nephropathy. And that's only perpetuated again by the data you put in. So bias and unreliability are absolutely critical. And goes back to Dr. Khanna's point, what is the purpose and what is the value of a clinician? And that is taking this information and making sense of it, understanding when that information is reliable, understanding where that information has bias, understanding whether or not the features of an algorithm developed, let's say, in a Western society is the same as, let's say, in an Indian community. That's up to the clinician. That's why clinicians are unbelievably invaluable in this process. Here's a real-world example in medicine. This was a study conducted by Microsoft using a large database to try to predict death in hospitalized patients. The goal was to come up with a predictive model to predict pneumonia so that those with high risk could be treated and those with low risk could be sent home. Look at the features of this model. Age. Well, as age went beyond 65, 67, the risk for mortality went up. That makes sense. BUN. When BUN went above 30 to 40, we see that the risk of death went up. That makes sense. Respiratory rate. When the respiratory rate went above 20 to 25, the risk of mortality went up. That certainly makes sense. But in the same database, what they also found was asthma was associated with lower risk. And you might then ask as a clinician, wait a second, how can asthma be a protective factor here? And the challenge is the following. The database was developed in a hospital system that mandated that if somebody was admitted with a pneumonia and had asthma, that individual was immediately transferred to the ICU and hence received better care. And so when you take this algorithm and ask the question, can you predict mortality in pneumonia? You can, but have you accounted for the fact that in this hospital system where this algorithm was developed, asthma moved patients to the ICU and hence was predictive? And how do you believe that or not? That's the reason you have a clinician. That's the reason you have a clinician to say, wait, in this hospital, asthma moved the patient to the ICU immediately. And so we shouldn't look at it as a protective factor. That's the bias involved here. So how do we proceed with bias and unreliability? Well, we first have to identify the clinical concept. We then have to validate that concept, and we have to continue to monitor. We have to make sure that artificial intelligence is working in the real world. We have to make sure that it's addressing the most important clinical tasks and that the algorithms used are helping us with the problem. The three components again, defining AI, certifying AI, and assessing AI. But the feature here and this circular diagram highlights the fact that it is iterative. In other words, it has to continue routinely. It's just like the algorithms in Amazon or Uber and other places that they continue to update themselves based on additional learning. That's the challenge with static algorithms that don't change versus algorithms that do. And again, you can argue for imaging, why would you need something that continues to change over time? IGA looks the same in India as it looks the same in China, as it looks the same in the United States. And maybe you don't need it to continue to modify. Well, as Dr. Khanna said, artificial intelligence in healthcare has reached all areas, basic biomedical research. You can do experiments in silico to come up with results. You can do translational research, drug target prioritization, drug discovery, drug repurposing, prediction of toxicity by getting a drug. And of course, as we've been talking about in potential areas of clinical practice, diagnosis, prediction, treatment, monitoring, risk stratification. It continues to explode in so many different areas. And on the top right, I ask, has this been a promise in healthcare, or is that promise been exaggerated? So let's spend a few minutes on some applications in nephrology. What are the current applications in nephrology? And this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but we will just spend a minute on some prediction tools, the most common applications, predicting AKI, predicting CKD, predicting progression, predicting cardiovascular death, and also where those areas first came out in artificial intelligence, namely histopathology and imaging, which has been adapted from radiology in general, which was one of the first areas that was using artificial intelligence in medicine. Well, prediction models, all of you are familiar with. When Gayatri was here, she worked on large databases. She identified features in those databases that looked at characteristics of patients that, let's say, did well and those that didn't, and used predictive modeling to figure out whether or not you could predict in general outcomes, whether it was AKI prediction, CKD progression, CV death, and so forth. We can take those algorithms, put it into a new database and say that algorithm predicts an outcome among individuals in a large database. This is really no different than what we do routinely outside of artificial intelligence, which is predictive modeling and regression analysis. But simply here, we're using large amounts of data and much more sophisticated tools. There have been publications in nephrology in this area. For example, internal and external validation of machine learning risk score for AKI. Is AKI the same in Chicago, as this study highlights, as it is in South America or in Africa or in India? We always have to ask, and this is where the clinician comes in, what are the strengths and weaknesses of these kinds of techniques to validate a risk score for acute kidney injury? In this study, which came out of Chicago, 3 centers, a large population was used. That's good. That's a strength. It improves the validity. Several hospitals were used. That's also a strength because practice patterns may differ slightly from hospital to hospital. Simple variables were included, serum creatinine, CKD, and so forth. And the goal here was to predict stage 2 or 3 acute kidney injury. Now, I will say the following before I talk about the limitations. Look at the title, Machine Learning Risk Score. Essentially, this was regression analysis using multivariable techniques in large databases. Again, putting machine learning in the title escalates its level of interest these days. Nevertheless, one of the challenges or some of the challenges and limitations for these kinds of studies are that they're often created in teaching hospitals and may not predict acute kidney injury and stage 2 or 3 AKI in non-teaching hospitals. This was in a single region in Chicago, and whether it works in Florida, whether it works in Venezuela, or whether it works in the Canary Islands is not clear. And the data was limited in that only inpatient data were used. Again, the importance of the clinician to making sure that she is able to explain the strengths and weaknesses of this kind of information. Here's another example from a Japanese group that wanted to come up with a risk prediction method to define rapid GFR decline in patients with chronic kidney disease. On the bottom, you see that those individuals that were not progressing versus those that were. But here are some strengths and weaknesses. The first, let me just describe very quickly what they did. They took a large database of real world data, which means information was collected whenever the clinician wanted to collect the information. In this case, urine protein was only collected whenever the clinician decided. It wasn't collected at any methodical, with any methodical features, meaning every week or every 2 weeks or every month or every 2 months. It was collected whenever they were collected. This was a large database using simple measures, and all kinds of kidney diseases were represented, some of the strains. But the limitations are also there in that they had limited patients, they had limited patient information. The proteinuria was infrequently collected, a small sample size, relatively speaking, and it was one country. And the final question the clinician might ask is, if urine protein was the best predictor, did we need to go through this large exercise of machine learning to come up with that answer? Or we could argue that even this technique identifies simple measures, and hence it reinforces the fact that urine protein was actually important. Well, in the last few minutes, let me just go back to imaging, which is how AI started in medicine, histopathology, and in this case, aneurysm diagnostics. And this was shared with me by some of my colleagues at Fresenius. Histopathology, no question, has been at the forefront. And it's because that we have digitized images now using large digitizers and have large numbers of biopsies in those digitizers and in large storage computers. In this particular study, they defined the glomerulus, the mesangium, the capillaries. They looked at diabetic nephropathy and was able to say that the algorithm correlated nicely with the pathologist in terms of defining diabetic nephropathy. Now, the good news here is because probably diabetic nephropathy looks the same histopathologically in India as it does, for example, in Africa, as it does in Australia, that having an algorithm to predict diabetic nephropathy is actually very powerful and can be used in many different parts of the world, provided that the pathology is stained appropriately and, more importantly, the features are similar. That's a strength. Laura Barisoni and her team have taken this one step further. You can create histopathology and use it for disease staging. That's the top left. You can use it for prediction. You can use it for predicting outcomes. But why limit the pathology to simply looking only at the slides? Why not come up with an algorithm that includes also the clinical information? Because all the clinical information, for the most part, is being collected. The rate of decline of serum creatinine, the amount of proteinuria, and on the right side of the screen, it highlights the fact that we can take the slides, digitize them, add significant amounts of algorithms and information to that, and link those slides with clinical knowledge and omics information and better predict outcomes. And maybe that represents the future in nephrology. And then as a final example, in this aneurysms that are most worrisome with regards to aneurysms, shared with me by my colleagues at Fresenius, you can see the different pictures of fistulae and their features of skin changes, size, tortuosity. You can come up with stages of aneurysm and create that on the right side, where you might define non-worrisome and ultimately on the right side, urgent referral because of ulceration. You can begin to create algorithms and teach and train using multiple images and data sets. And you can even create smartphone apps that begin to identify whether or not an aneurysm in a fistula is worrisome based on some of the features, the skin, the tortuosity, and the changes. And maybe that represents the future here. Well, it's not clear, but I will end where Dr. Khanna began, which is, what is the role of the clinical nephrologist? And I put some bullet points on the right side. Maintain a patient-centered perspective. That's the wonderful thing about practicing in India, because the patient is always center. Second, serve as the intermediary between our patients and AI experts. Now, I have to be careful here because I'm not saying protect your patients from AI experts. I'm saying work with the AI experts to help your patients understand what they're trying to accomplish. Third, acquire a general understanding of statistics and mathematical modeling, but most importantly, reliability, bias. That's where the clinician comes in. No question, these large databases require privacy, first and foremost. And finally, communication. That's where the clinician comes in. Communicate with your patients the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities of these kinds of algorithms. And finally, with this quote from the National Academy of Medicine, intelligence is not simply a function of computing power, because we're all enamored by the size, but increasing computing speed and storage makes us a better calculator. It does not make us a better thinker. And that's why the clinician is absolutely critical. So with that, Dr. Khanna, let me turn it back to you. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of this information with my colleagues in India.
Well, thanks, Ravi. And all of us are really happy to have heard your very eloquent discussion on AI and its clinical interpretation in nephrology. You took us through the basic science of AI and the bias and the issues, the challenges which AI gives us. And then you took us to the clinical aspects and its role in nephrology, especially with a few examples. And then the role of integrating clinical nephrology with AI. So that was a wonderful session, and it was an eye-opener. There will be a few questions, but I thought you wanted a little bit of the Indian perspective. And
Yes.
To be honest, big data analytics is in its nascent stage of development and testing, but the government has realized the importance of data collection, data bank, especially during the pandemic. And this budget actually has kept aside a lot of money for national digital health infrastructure development. They have realized the importance of using AI for healthcare, especially in rural area with a deficiency of skilled doctors. So they are probably making a health locker, an electronic national health register, and storage of health data. Each individual would be provided with a health card. This is all in the plan for this couple of years. They are focusing mainly on rural healthcare, diagnostics, prognosis, and how to reach the healthcare to the rural areas. Of course, we have our own issues. Most importantly, the data is not there. We have very diverse linguistic and delivery issues, and therefore the identification of voice would be very difficult. And of course, the validation of the data would be another problem. But roughly around $150 million were invested in the last couple of years with, by the AI startups, by these companies. And in some states, for example, Maharashtra, the Thadhani group has tied up with Niti Aayog. Niti Aayog, for your information, is our think tank, which basically helps the government in deciding as to what is more important and required. Similarly, the Telangana government basically wanted some tie-ups with the ophthalmic division and the retinal diagnosis and so on. So they've tied up with L.V. Prasad Institute. There is a body called Niramai, which is Bangalore-based, and it's a Bangalore-based company, and they're trying to help in breast cancer detection. So that's another company which has invested some money. Chiron X has, through deep learning algorithms, again, retinal investigations and trying to diagnose retinal lesions. Chiron X was what I mentioned. Then SigTuple is an AI with, helping in faster diagnostic tools. These are all Indian companies. And of course, Google and Microsoft has also entered into research partnership to develop many diagnostic tools. The basic advantage which many of these companies feel is that the scalability of getting healthcare to the villages would be there. Computer vision actually is trying to read X-rays in a much better fashion. But still, as I mentioned, we are still in the nascent stage, but definitely of it. And I think in the next few years, we will be getting much more, or we'll be hearing much more of AI in India. So the field is open for questions. I think there are a few of what are the major problems to prediction of CKD? You talked about the prediction model, and how would you try and help in this prediction of CKD with the AI methods is what Mr. Dr. Kottai Swami is interested in.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it gets back to some of the features you mentioned as well as I mentioned. So, for example, let me make it concrete. If one takes a database and uses Indian patients and CKD progression, we know that the diet of patients in India is different, let's say, than let's say the Western world. We know the treatments are different as well, or can be different. We know that potentially the progression of chronic kidney disease differs by way of decline. Maybe the decline of diabetic nephropathy is different in Indian patients than it is in other patients. And so you can imagine implementing an algorithm from one part of the world to India and having that be a challenge. That's an obvious challenge. But even within India, there may be differences. And so the only defense we have against that kind of bias and those kinds of challenges in these kinds of databases is really just to use large databases. Now, of course, in nephrology, we also don't have standard treatments. In oncology, for example, you might say the way to treat stage 1 breast cancer or stage 2 breast cancer is very standardized, and you can use algorithms to predict whether somebody then has a relapse or recurrence of breast cancer, because maybe in the world, the treatments for breast cancer are similar. My worry is in chronic kidney disease that it is not similar across different parts of the world, depending on what's available. There are certain therapies in India that are not available even in other parts of the world. And so that's the challenge in the prediction of CKD. Now, it's all not lost hope. You can use algorithms developed in your communities and in your countries that hopefully are more informative for your patients, and hence the selectivity and where the clinician comes in.
So I think Dr. Rajesh Kumar probably is taking that question further and asking what are the simple AI uses in our nephrology practice which can be put into use. Like you talked of Fresenius has a big database. Similarly, we have 2 or 3 large dialysis providers in India, and they too have a good amount of data with them. But Dr. Rajesh Kumar wants your views on how we can use in the simplest way AI in our nephrology practice.
Yeah, I would say today I feel, and I really enjoy hearing your perspective on this, Umesh, as well, that AI applications in nephrology today, as they sit in pathology, is probably where we should focus on and really push forward to make sure we get that correct. We can digitize images. We can standardize what diabetic nephropathy looks like. I mean, if clinicians can come together and come up with transplant criteria called the BANF criteria that we all know, then clearly AI tools can help in those categories. I think that represents kind of our first opportunity. That's not to say that prediction models will never work, except that I do think we need some early wins in nephrology that are standardized.
So I think, as you rightly mentioned, radiology and pathology were the front runners in using AI and trying to come with a good algorithm to have a better diagnosis. And I think then the breast cancer diagnosis people, and in India, a lot of ophthalmic institutions are using AI. But in nephrology, I think we are far behind, and IgA nephropathy seems to be an area which people are trying to get diagnostic advantage, or more often the prognosis of IgA nephropathy, which patients are more likely to have a worse prognosis. Although a lot of literature is there in sepsis management in ICU, but at least in India, we haven't yet used either AKI model predictions or sepsis management. So I don't know if in West, are they having any practical usage of AI for either sepsis or AKI?
Yeah, interesting. And let me actually, if you don't mind, Umesh, let me ask Dr. Gayatri. I mean, in her area, in terms of understanding even how treatments work and behave, is there an opportunity to use some potential applications of AI among Indian patients versus non-Indian patients?
I think if we come to a consensus, with respect to CKD management and, patient, characteristics, things like that, I think there can be a lot of application of AI in clinical trials, possibly to start with right away, because a lot of it, involves statistical modeling, that we use very late, in the game, but, possibly using AI in larger studies, not just, 10, 20 patient studies, but like, when we have thousands and thousands, of we already have a lot of clinical data, especially now randomized trials, but like, when we start looking at data that we already have, records of patients that we already have, to do retrospective studies, for instance, it may be like a easy application, to use AI right away and start with that, and then, extrapolate it to medications and things like that. We could possibly use it in investigational drugs, because we investigate so many, we have to analyze so many molecules, before we come to targets. So there could be like applications of AI, in that area as well. Those are like the two main things, that come to my mind, right away that, we could possibly start using in pharmaceuticals. But in the clinical practice, you highlighted, a lot of areas. I think a lot of doctors are just worried that it may need like a lot of investment and, data storage. And, I think the first step is to create awareness, through programs like this, to at least like start thinking, out of the box on, there are applications of AI, it's not that far away in the future. This is something that we could possibly start using in the next 5 years, a few years, not wait for, many, many years. But I think if we get all our talented nephrologists, diabetologists, physicians, first think of AI and technology as their friend, and start with just like having more awareness on like its uses. I'm sure with all the intelligent people that we have, we can come to multiple applications very soon in the future.
Yeah, really well said, Gayatri. Thank you.
Yeah, there are two questions, both seem to be similar. They seem to ask you as to your opinion. One is disease process and treatments in nephrology are highly patient-centric. Many conditions like IgA nephropathy have limited treatment options that make it difficult to train an AI program. Do we have any AI program for treatment in glomerular diseases in the West?
Yeah, great question, I would say. And I would say in those diseases where the pathology is standard and the standard treatments exist, one can argue maybe diabetes. Yes, those are probably the early adapters of this technology. But as you appropriately point out, Dr. Balan, IgA nephropathy is a challenge. It's treated differently in different parts of the world. And that's where the clinician will say, look, AI applications today are not ready. However, the pathology at that stage may be reasonable, but what happens after that, may be a challenge because of the treatment algorithms are different. So it's really a great point.
So the second question is, I understand, but this is by an anonymous attendee. I understand that currently what we lack is data for treatments, which of course everybody made that point that without data, there is no AI. But the problem is sharing anonymous patient info from various geosocial places. How can a normal practicing doctor store data so that when the data becomes usable, it will not be invalid? For that, are there any sort of data models that you would recommend? I haven't understood the question well, but probably they are looking at some data models to store, which if you are aware of it.
I'll just make 2 points because I know we've run out of time. Number one is that the storage of data today is so immense that we, even as a system, as a large system, are beginning to move it to the cloud because we just don't have enough space. For the practicing nephrologist to understand that even here in our own organization, we don't send data out because of issues of privacy and so forth, but they do sit in the cloud. And we do have to work with vendors to figure out how to send that data in an anonymous fashion is absolutely critical. And breaches are terrible because we have had breaches, as you know, around the world. And these are not issues we take lightly. And that's the other challenge. I mean, maybe Gayatri should support a talk on data management in nephrology itself would be a whole talk, but is absolutely critical to making sure we move forward appropriately.
So there could be a big, discussion later on the ethics and the challenges and the concerns. And we all know that Elon Musk has said that AI could be worse than nukes. And that's his very famous statement. And I'm sure people are worried of whether AI could be a Frankenstein monster, knowing the lack of intelligence which Homo sapiens has till now demonstrated as far as use of nuclear weapons and making nuclear energy more useful, I mean, more harmful than useful. So I think that's a concern which you also pointed out, and whether systems and checks and balances are in place or not, and how to go about doing that. That would be another talk as to it. Yes, Gayatri, you want to add something?
No, I think you summarized it really well. It goes back to the first point, where AI, it does not replace the physician, but basically is an additional excellent tool, that the physician can use. There's always a role for physician discretion, physicians like clinical judgment, and that tops everything. But AI can basically be your friend, and can actually be something supportive that we can all use to improve the efficiency of our practice, improve outcomes for our patients.
Okay,
Thank
so
you.
I think somebody wants to keep you away from dinner, so he's put one more question. If any AI tools are available for using prediction of disease models, I think you kind of touched upon it.
Yeah, there are CKD tools, AKI tools, transplant tools today that are available. Now, whether or not they're used widely is a different question for all the reasons we talked about. But I do think in the next few years, as Gayatri said, you'll see this more and more. And as you said, Dr. Khanna, how we use them will require an expert clinician.
Right. So I think we've come to the end of this webinar, which you will all agree has really been an eye-opener and food for thought. It's dinner time, so food for thought. And let's really think of the utility vis-a-vis clinical nephrology, and for us, more in the Indian perspective of how to use clinical nephrology, how to use AI in clinical nephrology. Well, thanks, Gayatri, for getting Dr. Ravi Thadarani, who you couldn't have got a better speaker to talk on a subject which is difficult, according to me, to hold attention of so many people. And I must thank personally, Ravi. It's been a pleasure listening to you. Thanks.
Honored, Dr. Khanna and Gayatri and Fourrts, really for the opportunity and to be able to share, and with colleagues in India, my homeland. It's just an absolute honor to share the stage here. I will just leave you with one comment, going back to Dr. Khanna's point, and that is the clinician is absolutely critical. And one famous person said, "I'd rather have real intelligence than artificial intelligence," and that's where the clinician comes in. So with that, let me turn it back to Mr. Nagashankar and Gayatri.
Thank you, Dr. Thadhani and Dr. Khanna. We've actually had a lot of interest, in this webinar. It also shows that clinicians are actually thinking forward, thinking about the future. There are a lot of I thank all the attendees, that are here today, because you're actually part of the change, that we're probably going to see in a few years from now. If all of us attending, start thinking along the lines, just open ourselves to new ideas, new things that we can do in medicine, we can make this field much more exciting and improve outcomes for our patients. I personally want to thank Dr. Thadhani and Dr. Khanna. Both of you have been amazing, and I couldn't have asked. It's like almost like the dream team right now. Thank you both.